Look, I think the biggest challenge we face in being on mission is that we ignore the obvious things that God's put around us. Like, this is the thing that I'm trying to remember right now, that so much of my mission in following Jesus is simply living ordinary life with gospel intentionality.
One of the big challenges of a church planner is that sometimes I can work so much on the church that I forget about teaching people how to be the church. So one of the things that I need to constantly do is be reminded of how I can help people go and be the church.
There's so much being said today about mission. I think it's really quite simple. If you're a true follower of Jesus, you can't help but be on mission because Jesus is on mission. And Jesus' mission is to seek and save those who are lost.
That's a great start, isn't it? I want. How did he get the kind of the circle around his head? That's what I want. I want the halo effect. Yeah. How's that look? I think it kind of looks like it's slipping off my head, which is kind of a little bit scary, but it probably happened a little while ago. Well, folks, it's really great to be here with you. Yeah, I'm hard to understand. I don't like how I talk either, but it's great to be able to speak to so many of you, and I'm having such fun in America. I got to tell you, I love this country, I love this people. I collect me some Americans, and I do. I have always had a love for this country and always believed in it. I've even had some fights for it, right? When people kind of go America, I'm in there. Actually, partly because I actually believe that America has still a very, very significant role to play in the evangelization of the West. And I would argue that as having someone who comes from Australia and who's bet my life in coming here to come serve the church in America, I actually do believe that if we don't win the battle for the kind of decline of the church here in the States, then it's not going to come from anywhere else. We will win or lose the battle over here in the States. The figures are not good all around the world. In a European setting, the lights are pretty much going out in Western Europe as we speak. Eastern Europe is not faring that well. Where I come from, the church is marginal to the extreme. We are really, really small, almost insignificantly small. So if it's not going to happen in America, where you are beginning to experience a significant amount of decline, then I don't think it's going to happen in the West. It's happening fine elsewhere. The church is rocking on in Africa and in Asia and in the southern parts of America, but it's certainly not happening elsewhere in the Western world. So there's a crucial time that we live in. And so it's critical for us to get the story right. And what I'm going to do, the session that I will do today, is a session that's trying to kind of articulate why I think we have to think differently about the church and how we have to act differently in bringing the gospel to Western culture. An assumption that more of the same is not going to get fundamentally different results. We have to find new ways of being the church if we're going to advance the cause of Christianity in the 21st century. What I'm going to say is going to sound a little bit like bad news at first, but I want to say I don't think it is. Because we're living in a time when we get a chance to reinvent ourselves, to rediscover ourselves as God's people, and the potency that is locked up in the church, that has been probably locked up for a long time in the church, can potentially come to the fore again, and that we get a chance to play again. We live in a time when our decisions make a difference in the world. And I think that that's a real privileged time to be, and a time that when every one of us get to play in the grand scheme of the unfolding of the kingdom of God. And that's got to be something to celebrate. And the fact that there's so many people here, a lot of young folk that are kind of getting in on the church planning thing. It's great to see a lot of women involved. I think that's often missing in the equation. I just want to celebrate with the sisters and the sisterhood. Good on you, girls. We need more of you around. And it's just very exciting to be here. It's a great vibey church. So What I want to say today is perhaps a kind of an articulation of why do we need to be missional. Because if you Americans get it, and I'm hoping that you do, I'm trusting that something in the entrepreneurial spirit, that perhaps you might discover your apostolic destiny for the nations. But I want to say not so fast. What we need to do first is to go down deep into the way we think about church before we quickly get to kind of shrink wrap it and sell it to the rest of the world, which I hope you will do, by the way. But first you've got to get it right. And one of the things that I think is going on in our days is discussion on missional church. I believe in the whole talk about missional church lies perhaps a cluster of ideas, a cluster of paradigms, the way we think about church that has nothing less than the future vitality of Christianity in the 21st century. It's not just a cute new term. There's a number of kind of years and years of deep thinking about ecclesiology, about the way we do church and how we are God's people, that go into that word missional. That is very important, that we just don't use it as another cool buzzword. It's something very important in the way that the church needs to kind of engage the Western context. And I want to share with you some of the reasons why that is the case in the short time I do have with you. So let me get into it. What I'm going to do is a bit of a mad professor thing. You're going to get it both in terms of a PowerPoint display. I hate PowerPoint, so I'm trying to dodge it. But there will be a PowerPoint up there. And then what I'm going to do is use the whiteboard a fair bit. But the whiteboard will follow the PowerPoint, if you can follow with me, okay? So I'm going to be kind of just backwards and forwards on that one. So if you don't mind playing with me on that, it's going to look a little confusing at first, but it won't be. I hopefully get it. Now I want to layer some concepts upon each other. And then once we layer them, I'm going to let them play with each other. And if we had time, we can throw some ideas around. But the first idea that I want to pass on to you is the idea of cultural distance. Cultural distance is a simple concept of, let's say you take a continuum that is a line, and you put 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 on it, and I put a little m next to it just to indicate missionary distance or cultural distance. The idea here is that each integer, each number, indicates one significant barrier to the meaningful communication of the gospel. One significant barrier to the meaningful communication of the gospel. In other words, in here, there's no significant barriers to you communicating the gospel. If you're going overseas, you'll see this a bit more clearly. What would be a significant cultural barrier to the meaningful communication of the gospel? One, language is going to be the obvious one at first, right? If you have to learn a language, you have to agree that it's going to get a lot harder to communicate the gospel meaningfully. If you add worldview or religion into the equation, and then race and history, a people's story that kind of defines them in a deep way, then you'd have to agree that when you're hanging out over here, it's significantly harder to kind of do mission over here than it is over here. Because you're dealing with cultural dynamics all down the line. The problem is, folks, and you can put the slide up if you'd like to give it a shot on the slide, is that the problem is what we find is that what has happened in our day is that the church as we know it has pretty much kind of hung out over here. We pretty much have lived in a time, and this is from Europe as well, at least the pre-Enlightenment Europe, where the church was central to society. You have the same idea in America, where the church plays a very, very central role in the cultural identity of a people, and that everyone is really within the significant distance to the church. Here's the problem, is that in our time, the whole thing has gone and shifted in this direction on us. In other words, it's got all more complicated, partly through kind of mass immigration, but partly through what we call subculturalization. There's a whole lot of different urban tribes now. In just youth subcultures alone, there's probably 50, 60 different youth subcultures that you have to deal with. Each of them take their culture a little bit more seriously. You've got this gay subculture, the gay lesbian thing. To reach into their world is significant. It's difficult. So what we find now is, yes, you have Jews and you have Muslims down over here, but you've got everything in between. And you've got your unchurched and your dechurched and all kinds of complication. It's got all kind of complicated on us. It's not as simple as it was before, where we were reaching between M0 and M1. Everyone follow me on here? So here's the deal, is that, and here's another thing in the factor this in, that this is getting smaller. We know from all church statistics that church attendance is in the decline in America. It's not what it used to be. And I'll look at some of those dynamics in relationship to my country, but also you can play it out in terms of yours. This is not getting easier. The number of the church population is getting smaller. For many of you, this is not going to feel like this is not happening in your part of the world, because you might come from part of the Bible Belt where it doesn't feel like this is happening. All I want to suggest to you is go and think about New York on the one hand, and that whole kind of eastern seaboard, and go to the other side and think of anything up from Portland through to Seattle, and you'll see the same phenomenon that's happening in Europe. Increasingly, the church is being pushed out, and it's becoming harder for the church to communicate cross-culturally in that equation. And that creates a whole lot of problems for us in the way we communicate. So one of the things that we have to learn is that all communication of the gospel now in Western settings is cross-cultural. We have to become cross-cultural missionaries again. And this is different to the way we think about church. We have to begin to think about what does it mean to take people's culture and their place seriously. Part of the problem with this, folks, and I have to bear some responsibility for introducing the term attractional into the equation. When we talk about attractional church, and it's important you get this because I have to defend the term now. I'm going to try and kind of explain it, right? Attractional church, we say, is what the church's missionary stance in relationship to a culture. When you are central to culture and everyone is within your cultural orbit, a church can assume that people come to us to hear the gospel. That's fair enough. They all speak the same language. They're both all the same basic socioeconomic group. You don't have to do all cross-cultural dynamics to speak meaningfully within the M0 to M1 circle. Fair enough? So attractional church works very well there. The problem is it doesn't work all that well, or increasingly down here, it becomes increasingly problematic. Because guess what? If you bring someone to the Lord, if let's say you work in a place, or people in your church work in a place where they're meeting with people who are significant distance from the church, as they know it, and then they come to the Lord and you bring them back to church, as we do. Because that's the expectation, is that we do outreach and then we pull them in, we'll drag them in. And I'm not being silly about that, it's outreach and in-drag. In the sense, this is what we expect, is that, and the thing is that the church socializes people into this. The better you do church, the more people are socialized into church. That's good. That's what churches should do. We should be socializing people into discipleship and Christianity. But the problem is, folks, it breaks the connection that the people had with their base community over here. Because once they become a member of that, they no longer have any significant connection over here. We know, and this is old statistics, I would love to have someone who can help me with some new statistics. This is over 10 years ago. We knew that over 10 years ago, within 3 to 5 years of a person becoming a Christian, they would no longer have any significant relationships with those outside the church. Now that's a problem because the gospel spreads on relational grounds. And why I say I introduced the term attractional, I have to defend it, fair enough, but I would now use, if I had the chance to kind of redo it, I would say extractional. Because let me say this in a technical sense. All mission in cross-cultural or complex cultural environments, when you do mission, if you act attractional church in a missionary environment is extractional. Here's the word I would use, extractional. Because what it does do is it extracts people out of their prevailing kind of networks of friendships and culture over there. And that again becomes a significant barrier to be able to kind of spread the gospel. Because the way we're going to do it is by being enabling people to reach their own folk where they're at. And here's another problem with it, folks, is that when we act attractionally, that is, we expect everyone to come to us to hear the gospel on our terms and in our kind of zone. We're asking them to do the cross-cultural work to come to us. You see the problem? We're saying you become the cross-cultural missionary to come to church. We're not going to go to you. A couple of problems arise out of this. One, it violates the fact that we are the sent people of God in the first place. The word missio is the same as was the English word sent. The whole church is a sent people. The Father sends the Son. The Son is a missionary. The Son and the Father send the Spirit. The Spirit is a sent God. He is a missionary God. And Jesus says, as the Father sent me, so I send you. The church is a sent people. There's no such thing as an unsent Christian. We are all missionaries. Therefore, we're under obligation to take the message out to where people are at. Not for them to come necessarily to where we're at. It works all right. It works all right over here. But it's problematic as culture gets increasingly more complex for you. And this, again, this explains what happens in New York and some of the more multicultural parts. And I guess Atlanta is experiencing this more than it would have done maybe 10 or so years ago. Because Atlanta has become one of the place for the cultural creatives, hasn't it? So people now come from all over the world to be part of this city. So cities experience this all the time. And this is why it's a problem. I hope that at least that's kind of clear. If it isn't, tough. I'm going to move on. So that's the first concept. I want you to kind of just pop that into the equation, called cultural distance. Just an easy way of kind of articulating. It was done by a guy called Ralph Winter. And they generally used it in overseas missions. I found it useful here. I'm going to just put a little kind of line up there like that so you just remember that, right? Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to kind of refer you to some research that was done in Australia. And what I'm going to do is I'll tell you the Australian statistics, and I just want you to think in your own heads and perhaps vote with me if I say that's positive, that's maybe, that's negative, okay? So when I ask you to kind of vote to what people think about these things, you reflect on your own situation and give me a reflection back, okay? The research that we did was done by a very consistent, very thorough research on what people, non-Christian people, they had to be self-identifying non-Christians, thought about God, Jesus, spirituality, and the church. So now this is Australia, which is, according to Eddie Gibbs, the most secular country in the world. It's hard to imagine that with some of the others, but it's somewhere around there. It's very, very secularized, okay? So what do you think that most Aussies outside of the church thought about God? Now, we've got to move away from our kind of Trinitarian constructs and all that and our understanding of God. I'm just talking about a generic understanding of God. Think for your situations. What do most Americans think? Does God exist? He or she, whatever, power, force. Positives. Maybes? Negatives? Well, actually in Australia we were shocked. We discovered that actually it was over 90% of people believed in some idea of God. Right? So it got a big tick in our country, which again was a surprise and was very thorough research. Jesus, when it came down to what people thought about Jesus, what do you think? Think in your own setting, but first positives? Maybes? Negatives? It's interesting that. I won't try to explain that. What actually happens in our setting, it comes up very, very positive again too. And let me just play this out a little bit more, because I think here is real leverage. And for us as a church, I think Jesus is real leverage asset, as it were. I come from a marketing background. In marketing, there's a thing called perceived set. And a perceived set is in any product line, any type of product, that most people will remember is 3 brands within a product line. So, bro, if I kind of picked on you over there and I said no one's to help him over here, and I said, very quickly tell me toothpaste, give me brands now. Next. No one can help him. Okay, Wakrafresh, got any more? Crest, okay, he's done pretty well. Okay, any more? Right, the general rule is that we'll remember 2 or 3 out of our perceived set. Any marketer tries to get their brand in the perceived set, because when it comes to buy, you will kind of draw out of your perceived set to do that. Okay? Now here's me just playing, and I wish I could do this, but here I would kind of lay a bet on it. We Aussies do bet a little bit sometimes. I generally don't, but that here's the thing, is that if you ask the average non-Christian person, who is the greatest person who ever lived, I'm going to say that most of them are going to say it's Jesus. Because who else are you going to say, put in there? They're going to say maybe Gandhi. Well, Gandhi looks to Jesus, you know. He gets all his inspiration for his whole kind of ethos of life from the Sermon on the Mount. Mother Teresa, same deal. Who else? Michael Jordan. Only if you kind of come from Chicago, yeah? So you understand what I'm saying here? The most significant person who ever lived? Who else are you going to put there? So I guess he's going to come up in the top 3 every time. And I would think most times I would kind of venture a bet that it's going to be number 1. Now you can work with that. Most people think Jesus is pretty cool, actually. And research is pretty clear right across the board in that. Even in Europe, Jesus comes up good. Okay, spirituality. What do you think that Aussies, you read Americans, what do you think that most... And spirituality is the search for meaning, significance, kind of purpose, belonging, all those things that associate. Positives. Maybes. Negatives. Yeah, you got it right. Most people actually think it's very important now. Gone are the days when it was just pure atheism. Most people think discovering these kind of things is very, very important for us. And it's one of the biggest sections in your bookstore, which is the self-help, spirituality kind of area in life, right? When it came to the church, what do you think that Ozzy said about the church? And you can read for your setting here. Positives. Is no one going to give me a positive? Maybes? Negatives? Whoa. Now that's interesting. This is a group of leaders in the church. But you're actually right, because actually the phenomenon right across the Western world, we say it's Jesus, yes, church, no. The church comes up in my country really badly because the history of the church has been very oppressive there. It was part of we were a penal colony and all that stuff. But the church played a very key role in suppressing the people. So it comes up extremely badly. But I would say this is probably true right across the board. Now, let me say also, the church is an easy target. Always has been. And I think sometimes it's just plain unfair. But be it as it may, I think we've earned a fair bit of stick over here, for what we've kind of behaved like. Here's the deal, and this is what we can work with. This is maybe where in the good news and the bad. The good news is, folks, our basic message is sound. God, Jesus, spirituality. Most people report significant interest in these things. However that might play out. It might not be the way we prefer it, but most people will say, I'm on a journey here somewhere, and really positive, tick, tick, tick experience on it. This is where the problem is, right? So where is leverage to be gained? What has to be changed? In the strategy question is where, if you give minimum amount of effort, does it have maximum results? And it's over here. Now you enter into the discussion of missional church, or missional ecclesiology, if you prefer the technical jargon. Missional ecclesiology is where the church, as the delivery mechanism of the gospel, has to adapt itself in order to deliver its message. Because if I was in business, I would say this: you've got a darn good product, but your delivery system's stuffed. You're going to be out of business soon unless the delivery system changes. That's where leverage is gained. And this is where much of the way we have to change in order to engage culture is going to be over here. And that's the significant thing of our day. We are discovering there's a revolution in our day that is kind of playing out in this regard. My time. Okay, good. Got a sense. Now, what I want, everyone with me on that, is just basic stats. And it kind of, I think, would resonate. I wish I had the comparison over here. I'm not really a researcher or a statistician, nor the son of one. Believe me, my dad ain't there. But I think it kind of plays out an anecdotal thing. So here's the deal. I'm going to take this. I'm going to take the church that we know is not doing that well, right across the Western world. I'm going to take it out. It's called the traditional. The traditional church, or the mainline church in this country, is dying every day. In my country, one of the churches that's leading the decline is 20% exponentially per annum decline. That is, at the end of every year, there are 20% less people in their churches than there was the year before. Now, you talk about hemorrhaging, and this is long-term trended decline. So let's just take them out of the equation in the meantime. A lot of nominal affiliation comes out with them, right? In Australia, 18% of people claim to associate with the church group. Only 2% of them, just less than 2%, are evangelicals, right? So that's where we play. I knew it's going to be a little higher, but be it as it may. We're going to take these babies out, okay? We're going to leave the church that we know that is doing pretty good. In fact, is carrying the weight, carrying the whole weight of mission in this country, and in my country, is what we call the contemporary church growth church. It's probably one symbolized very much by Dr. Lovejoy's Love Palace here. I had to do that, right? This contemporary churches are carrying the load. The mega church particularly is the one that's carrying the main burden for evangelization in America, without doubt. So all hats off. This is not a critique. It's just saying this is the one that's doing the job and doing it well. But let me play this out so that we just know this is our situation, and hopefully this will become clear why innovation and mission is important for us, or innovation in mission. If you put it up against the population, now let me play this with Australia, and then I'm going to change the equation for you, okay? In Australia, I've said that we've got 2% evangelical, right? So our attendance isn't even 2% in churches like this, but let's play it at that, right? So I would say this form of church, represented in our country by Hillsong, probably, let me take this out because this must be irritating some of you here. This form of church, represented by Hillsong as a good Aussie kind of version of it, actually probably has, and I'm using the term cultural appeal here. I'm appealing back to this little baby over here, so 01, right? This church, I reckon, has marketability or cultural appeal to, and this is me being generous because it's not attendance, 10 to 12%. I think there are 10 to 12% of Aussies, called the aspiring middle class, who don't abuse their kids, who probably have kind of similar gospel values. It's the kind of plus Jesus equals factor. In other words, there's a strong correlation between the culture between here and here. It's not attendance. Attendance is around 2%. Okay? So appeal, I reckon it'll work up to 12. And let me really be generous and say 15%. Let's say 12 to 15. It's not attendance. That's a generous kind of appeal. Right? Now let me just play this for you guys. I think in America it's much, much more. Play with me. What do you think it is for America? %60 appeal? That you would say that 60% of Americans would go to. This is not attendance. We know that you don't have 60% attendance in evangelical churches. So I've had it, probably I can hear you probably better in smaller things. We generally play around, people generally say, well, 35%. And I'm going to be generous and say 40. If you average out from the kind of the more secularized east and west coast through to, I'm averaging out because the part of the country would be a lot better. So I'm going to just say, for the sake of it, 40%. Now, two problems arise out of this, folks, and this is where hopefully is it should begin to dawn on you, the significance. Two issues arise. I actually had to pay for my sins many years ago by being a denominational exec. So I did 12 years of that, right, while I was church planning and all that stuff. So I played the both thing. It just about killed me, but anyway. So it's a very, very hard ministry, that. It's a very sad ministry, I think. Yeah, because you don't get to see a lot of fun things. You get some of the worst kind of things, right? Be it as it may. In my denomination, which are like the independent Christian churches, back in my country, I guess, and this is educated guess, but I guess that most of our churches, these are meant to be churches, okay? Okay, they all going to want to come like this, right? They all think that this is the answer to the problem. How do I know that? Well, most of them go to Hillsong every year. Most of them read the books coming out of America, coming out of the megachurch movement. They aspire to that. They follow this model. They believe that this is the answer. Here's the problem that you got. I want you to see this for what it is, right? And it's not saying this isn't of God and God doesn't use it at all. God clearly is, and it's carrying the burden. God is clearly using it. So don't mishear me here. Here's the problem, is what I call a strategic problem. We have 95% of our churches trying to become, because remember we've taken the traditionals out, 95% of our churches trying to become like this, that at best are only ever going to reach 40% of the population. Does anyone see the problem there? You've got all our churches trying to compete, if I use the kind of marketing term, for the same slice of the market. And that creates a massive sense of kind of dilemma over here. Because I know this much, folks, that most of us can't become like this. You know why? We know that in this country there are 1,200 churches over 2,000. That actually has grown in the last 10 years. It's grown to over 1,200 over 2,000. There are around 10,000 over 1,000. So the megachurch movement is vibrant, right? But how many churches do you think there are in this country? How about 430,000? And what's the average size of those churches? How about 70 or 80? So I know that most of you can't do it. Even after 40 years of church growth methodology, even if I had to take that you guys represent some of the more hopeful, more energetic types, I would still say most of you couldn't do it. Because whatever it takes to make this happen, whatever it takes to kind of really pull this off, I know that most people don't have it. One, the combination of timing, situation, skill, managerial, because it takes real managerial skill. All those things that come together. Gifting, resourcing, all that it means to take this. Most of these don't have it and probably not going to pull it off. So it's a counsel of despair for them. Right? And it's not that they're unaware of what this represents. Clearly that this is the model that is presented that is the hope of the church in the West. The problem is it's a strategic problem. But there's another problem associated with this, which for me, as someone who feels deeply the missionary call to the Western world, is what I call a missionary problem. Because I would say, what about the 60% of Americans who won't go to this? How do we know that they won't, right? Research is clear. Let me take you back to the same research that did this in my country. They asked the question about this former church and what do these bods over here think about that? In our case, it was 85% of our population, right? There were two poles of response, and it goes like this. On the one, I call it blasé. We say it like, good for you, mate, not for me. I'm glad for you. It clearly does something for you, but it's not for me and me missus, right? Yeah. Off you go. Blasé. And then you've got on the other side, no, nay, never. They will ruin your life, take your children, take your money, screw around with your head, right? I'll never go there. Okay? That's the other side. Actually, I think the blasé are harder to reach. Yeah, well, that's harder than that. At least they've got some sort of value base over there. But I would say these people are not easy to reach. So there's 60% in this country, which is increasing. By the way, let's just remember this. This is declining on us, right? For whatever it is, the appeal of the church is going down, not going the other way. So this is an increasing segment of your population. And even if you cut it at 50-50, you've still got 50% of Americans who, for whatever reason they report, will not go to one of the contemporary forms of church, which we have vested our hopes in. And this is what I call a missionary problem. Because here is, what does church look like for these people? And how are they ever going to get to hear the gospel if we don't take it to them? And by the way, we are the sent people of God. We're the ones who are under obligation to take the gospel out to our people, to our nation, and to represent Jesus in all the spheres and domains of society. And that's where it gets to play. So the question is, what about the 60%? And I've got to say this. I know this, and I just know this from a person who works with kind of church dynamics and writes about missional church. I'd say that more of the same will not get fundamentally different results. We know that's the definition of organizational insanity, isn't it? It goes like this. Trying to achieve significantly different results by doing the same thing better. You will get results here by doing this better. You might reach into the 40%, but it's not attendance, remember. Don't think it's attendance. You might get attendance up to 40% if you maximize this. And so you should do this. Those who do this well should do it better. And we should all be saying, we're rooting for you, brothers and sisters. We should, off you go. Because you represent the great hope for a vast majority, a lot of our population. But what about the 60%? Because more of that is not going to resolve this. The research is clear. And we might not like that, but that's what is being reported. Because remember, if you go back to this thing over here, people have problem with the church. So that's one thing. Let me play this out another way. Einstein said that the problems of the world cannot be resolved by the same type of thinking that created those problems in the first place. Let me translate that for the church. The problems of the church cannot be resolved by the same type of thinking that created those problems in the first place. Let me play this out visually for you. I'm just going to do this in a number of ways. If I want to dig a hole over there, it's no good digging this hole deeper. You're going to agree with me, yeah? Well, you know where this is leading. You watch our behaviors, folks. This is exactly what we do. We just dig over here. Now, what happens if you dig this hole deeper? You get deeper into a hole. You become more and more vested in this hole. The problem is if you need to dig the hole over here, it's no good digging this hole deeper. Just another rejig of this kind of... Did you use that expression? Rejigging? Did I say something rude? Well, I didn't mean it. I can plead ignorance here. Another kind of rework of this isn't going to resolve this problem. And I say, don't hear me wrong here, folks, please. God is using it maximum. But it's not going to pull it off the missionary problem that you face. More of this is not going to resolve your problems. What got you here will not get you there, is another way of saying the same thing. Another way of saying it. You're perfectly designed to achieve what you're currently achieving. If we're achieving in America at the moment a decline of the church, there's a design factor. You know why I can say that? Because the church that Jesus designed was designed for growth. You know, I know that. It says in Matthew 16 that the gates of hell are not going to prevail against us. It's not the image of the church being a fortress and hell kind of pumping up against the walls of the church and the church holding up against that. It's the other way around. We're on the attack and they have got to defend. In other words, the church that Jesus built was designed for advance, not for defense. It's an advancing force. Is that... Ooh, it's there. So it came at the right time, isn't it? Quoting the Bible at last. I believe that the church is designed as a mission agency in the world. We are a message tribe. If you're a message, you've been given a message. It makes you a messenger, doesn't it? If someone gives you a message, it's a message that makes you messenger. And I think somehow we've got to take up the responsibility of what it means to deliver the message to the 60% in ways that are sustainable. Let me suggest just a couple of other things, and then we can call it quits. If I can find my notes. No, I can't. Yes, I can. Just to give you some kind of maybe practical ways of what I think we do over here. One, it's going to require innovation. I think it's fair to say if more of the same is not going to get fundamentally different results, then what the church will look like here will be different over there. Is that a fair assumption? In other words, the battle that we will face, and this is where you madcap Americans, I hope you get to shrink wrap it and sell it to the rest of us. I really do. But not before you've thought about this carefully. Not before you've gone down and at the level of imagination have thought about the church on its most fundamental level. Because the problem is it's no good just reinventing this, right? You can't sell a Christendom approach to a post-Christendom world. You have to surprise them because they've got antibodies. Europe is a good example of this, right? This is where we got our idea of the church from in the first place, Europe. And let me tell you, the light's going out as we speak. As we speak. You can go to Germany, the birthplace of the Reformation, and I tell you, and I've been there many times, you're hard-pressed to find any viable witness to the Lord there. And when you do, it's a struggling group of people who are anxious about their future. They don't seem to have any idea what to do about it. They are completely marginalized. Very, very deeply struggling. This is Germany, where we got the whole Reformation thing in the first place. Switzerland is no better. So they're not going to have the answer for us. In other words, the answer that they have can't just be a reinvention of what they've always done for the last 2,000 years, or the last 1,700 at least. They have to find a new form. They have to discover themselves in a much more fundamental way. In other words, I would argue that the battle for the future of the church in the West will be won at the level of imagination, or it will be lost at that level. It's how our capacity to imagine new possibilities. Einstein also said this, if you can't imagine it, you cannot do it. Now I would take Einstein seriously on this matter. He says, I value imagination more important than I value knowledge. Because knowledge is limited, imagination can explore the universe, right? In other words, it's how we conceptualize, how we discover a new idea of the church, a new conceptual way of thinking about the church that is different to the way we do it over here. Do this. It's a both and, folks. I'm not saying it's not. But I'm interested in the and here, because if we don't find the and, if we don't find that, I think, and I say this with great sadness, the church will continue to fade out of Western society. You'll go the way of Europe eventually, even though it won't be for the same reasons. Because already the trend is set in America. And trends, once they're set, and they're long-term trended, are very difficult to change around. Very difficult indeed. So we need to find innovation and the courage to try and find new forms of the way to express the church. So what we teach, and I'm part of a group called Forge Mission Training Network, and by the way, we're launching in Chicago in April, somewhere around there, at Wheaton College. What we say is that as a missionary is that you've got to go among the people. Don't presume you know what church is like. You're a missionary again. You're all missionaries. You have to begin to think like missionaries. You've got to then take culture seriously. You go among a people group. And once you're in that people group, you ask two basic questions. What is church for this people group? Not presuming you know the answer until you get there. Because you can only ask that question within the context of the mission and then articulate the church. In other words, you watch where people are going. Where do they meet? Why do they meet? What's the energy? Who leads? What's the dynamic? Where's the gatekeeper? In other words, you try and find what is really happening and you articulate the church into that. In other words, churches here are going to look very much more diverse. We're going to have to be very inventive and cultural in the way we express it over here. It shouldn't be just one monocultural model over here. There's going to be just a way of going about it. It's more a thinking about the church than it is a model of the church. Yeah? That's the missional thing. It's imagination. We call it missional imagination. It's a way of thinking about the church. The other question, and by the way, behind that is the notion that from good kind of theology, good missiology, it says that we've always thought that the church has got the mission. So we've always put, if I say it technologically, I'm being mad, Professor, you might as well let me do that, is that we said that missiology has always been a subset of ecclesiology. But actually what we're saying, actually it's the other way around, is that missiology produces ecclesiology. In other words, let me say it in a way that anyone can understand. I could just know you think I'm smart, that's all. What we're saying is not so much that the church has a mission, my friends, but the mission has a church. In other words, mission precedes the church. You do mission and the church comes out the back, and don't be too visual about that, by the way. You do mission and church is something that happens out of mission. It's probably a way of kind of thinking about it. It's probably a bit better. And so we only go there and we can only ask what is church. The other one is to ask what is gospel for this people group. Not presuming we know how to answer that question until you've listened to the existential issues, the religious quest that a people exemplify. And by the way, different people have different ways of expressing that. Unless we listen very carefully to how people express their search and their yearning and their struggle and their brokenness and their sin and their longing for redemption, unless we first listen to that, we're never going to be able to bring the gospel as good news to bear on that. You know that saying that if all you've got, the only tool you've got is a hammer, then everything begins to look like a nail. And we're following a Reformation model, where people did feel their sin before God because, why? They were Christendom. They were all Christians, folks. They felt the holiness of God. They just could not get close to God because they felt guilt. Why? The church made sure that they felt guilty because it made a lot of money off that, called indulgences. Now, do people in our day feel guilty? I don't think so. They don't feel guilty. They might feel shame. That's a different thing. But for the most part, most people don't feel guilty. If you only approach our culture with the old scripting, I'm not saying that justification by faith is not real and vital, but it's God's job to kind of convict people of sin. Here's the deal. If we just approach them in the old reformational script, then what we do is we have to make people feel bad before they feel better. And then we become these kind of people, right? And isn't the church known as that? The Pharisees, the tongue-clucking people, the ones that Jesus reserves his worst and harshest possible criticisms for. He doesn't have harder words for anyone than the Pharisees, right? And we have become them if we're not careful. We are meant to be the good news people. Grace, mercy, goodness, faithfulness, these things that we can stand for. And let me tell you, people are dying for it. They're telling us that. The yearning for God, the kind of respect and honor for this person who still is the kind of the glowing, the towering figure over Western history, over world history, in fact. He's still the towering figure. No one matches him. Spirituality, the fact that most people are yearning for some sort of meaning in life. Well, we have now got to think we can play, baby. We can do this. But we've got to change here if we're going to do it. And we need to become the good news people. So here's the deal. You plant the gospel, you don't plant churches. If you start where our most fundamental message is about Jesus, that's where you start. How do you do mission in the 60%? You can lead with Jesus and trust that the Holy Spirit's going to convict him of their sin, and you listen to where their sin is. And actually, I would argue, and I don't have time to kind of make my point, but I think actually, if you use the taxonomy of sin of idolatry, idolatry is actually a far better clue, and I'm with Tim Keller on this, who works in New York, right? He said the way to actually approach the modern kind of person that we deal with in the street is that the fact that they are enslaved to their idols of work, of sex, of relationships, of things that have bound them, of image and all this. These are idols, enslaving, that promise everything but deliver nothing. That's a better way of actually dealing with the kind of the struggle that people face, because most people will acknowledge that. Their work takes far too much time of my life and I'm not getting meaning from it. That's idolatry, folks. You can deal with that. And the gospel's got a lot to say with it. So get more tools than a hammer. And then begin to listen to the people out there. And then plant the gospel and the church will flow out of it. You trust that God has got his intention of growing his church is more than what you've intended. And you church planters, you actually are my heroes. And I am here to serve you. And whatever it takes to get you guys off the ground. But here's the deal. We live in a time when our decisions matter, folks, more than ever before. There seems to be a weight and a capacity, a gravitas in our decision-making now. That the decisions we make now will affect the course of history. They will affect the quality, even the viability of Christianity in this century. Now that could work two ways. Or if we are cowardly and we refuse to kind of move out and, for some of us, invent or innovate new forms of church, then all we'll be left is with the same. That's a choice you are making in a time when strategically it's important to make choices for creativity and innovation. You're the people most likely to do it. You're church planters. Church planters should be missionaries first before you are planters of church, because that's your most vital starting point. Go back to the gospel. Allow that to kind of give you a fluidity in the way you express the rest, and let God do it. Because that's what he's on about. He's on about the redemption of the world, and he wants more churches than we could even possibly produce in a generation. But we can do it, and there's power and potency in the people of God. And I believe in you madcap Americans that you have an apostolic destiny that you have yet to access. And when you do, the world will change. Amen.